money or dollars we spend during festival? Well, not counting lodging. How many festival events would you like to attend? And age if you're willing to share 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s?
30s.
Education level if you're willing to share. High school, college, college graduate, graduate.
Yeah, well, I just...
And level if you're willing to share below 30,000, 30,000, under 50,000, 50,000, under 70,000, 60,000.
Paul already done.
30 to under 50.
How did you hear about festival? All that by Charleston newspapers?
Yes.
Charleston radio ads.
Yes.
Festival ads, Nelsonville and Belfast. Festival website. Festival brochure schedule.
Yes.
Graffiti. Herald Putnam Dispatch. Herald Tri-State Visitors Guide. State Journal. Social media.
Yes.
Facebook, Twitter, others.
Facebook, Twitter.
TV ad. WOUB. West Virginia Living Mag. West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Living Mag and Public Broadcasting.
West Virginia Tourism Mag.
No.
Other.
Sure.
Word of mouth or
Yes.
whatever. What do you like best about festival?
There's just lots of different things to do.
What would you like to see at festival? Any artist suggestions and different types of events?
I can't think of anything right now.
Thank you. Just picking the shots. So unless you'd like to take a program, Marcus, I guess we could. Would you?
I'm fine.
It'd be about the same answer.
Yeah, it'd be
Yeah.
about the same answer.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Shall we dish our ditches? There's a bigger screen. Yeah. Not enough.
One another glass.
packing up. But he said there's beer there in the cooler. Grab what you want.
Go back to work. It's going to be okay.
Good evening. Good evening. Yes.
Good evening. Welcome to the Clay Play Center and our conversation with Dex, Sex, and Money host Anna Sale and Dwight Garner. The show's going to begin in about 5 minutes. There's plenty of refreshments. Refill your plates and get a seat. Conversation's going to begin in 5 minutes.
Smooth stylings. Right.
For the padding. Hey.
Talents hang in. Should they go someplace?
Are they over here?
Yeah, they're right there. Okay.
So here's what I had in mind. You can go ahead.
Look at something to nibble on.
There's all kinds of new.
doing? It's good food, huh? You know?
Good evening, everybody. Glad you're here. My name is Larry Gross. I'm the co-director of Festival Charleston, along with Brittany Javins, who's out in the audience here tonight. And we're happy to be co-producing this event with West Virginia Public Broadcasting. We're very excited about that. We hope in the future we'll be able to do a lot more during Festival in cooperation with the West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I want to thank Mayor Jones and the City Council for their support of Festival Charleston, and also all the sponsors you see on the back of this program. If you don't have one of these programs, there's a few out there on the way out. They're all over town, and if you haven't made plans for the rest of Festival, a lot of great things are going on tomorrow night right here in this hall. There's Trombone Shorty. If you don't have tickets for that, there are still tickets left. So I hope you will join us for many, many things over the course of Festival. You can also find it on your computer or on your smartphone. FestivalCharleston.com will give you the whole schedule. Speaking of smartphones, I'm sure you know it's time to turn them off, turn them down, black them out. We don't want to have any interruptions during the interview. And now it's my pleasure to welcome the Executive Director of West Virginia Public Broadcasting, Scott Finn.
Hey, thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. So this is a special night for several reasons, and thank you all for being here. First of all, this is the first time that West Virginia Public Broadcasting has ever had a live taping of a podcast, an event like this. And it's also a homecoming, of course, for Anna Sale. whom everybody knows, and I will allow her to introduce herself later. And also for Dwight Garner, book critic for New York Times. And I think it says a lot that I got to meet Dwight. It was at an event that Anna organized. It was a party in New York City for expat West Virginians. And so wherever Anna goes, she does two things. She supports West Virginia, and she brings people together for great conversation, which is what we're here for tonight. So for all of you, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Anna Sale and Dwight Garner.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Can everyone hear me okay? No. Can you hear me okay? There's Dwight. Let's see. We got this? No?
How's mine?
Let's see. Dwight's good.
That's all we need, really.
Yeah, I know. We're going to get the sound fixed. We're plugging it in. 1, 2, 3, 6. I'm just going to speak really loudly to say first that it's so wonderful to look out and see so many people who I'm friends with, who were around when I was growing up here in Charleston, who drove carpools for me while I was growing up, and then also who really nurtured me when I was learning how to be a journalist here in West Virginia and starting at West Virginia Public Radio. I know there are many people here who I've interviewed. There are many people here who edited me, and it's just thrilling to see all of you here together. Makes me really happy. I hope you heard that. We're getting there. Oh, is it there? I think we got it.
All right.
Okay, so let me tell you a bit about how tonight is going to go. When I met Dwight, it was in 2012, and we started kind of communicating pretty regularly, and one of the things that he told me at one point was he was listening to me hosting. I sit in and substitute host for the talk show in New York sometimes, and he like yelled at me one time when we were together and said, "Speak up, talk more, interrupt." And so that's how we're structuring this evening. I'm gonna speak up and interrupt, and we're gonna have a conversation. So I'm gonna ask him some questions, he's gonna ask me some questions, and then you're gonna ask questions. We're gonna have some time for question and answers from the audience, and then also from people who are watching over the internet. If you're streaming, thank you. But I wanna start by first introducing Dwight Garner. He is, of course, one of the book critics at the New York Times, one of 3, but it's Dwight Garner's byline that I make a beeline to whenever I see it, and I'm going to tell you a few reasons why. Dwight Garner is funny. He brings a character, like there's some rock and roll to his reviews. He also is always looking out for whether someone is capturing America, and he has a very broad view of America, which sometimes can be rare in the literary world. He also has no patience for laziness, and he has no patience for unprincipled showmanship. And we can talk about that more. But when I really noticed Dwight Garner's writing, the piece that I was like, who is this guy? He was writing a travel piece about driving to West Virginia. And in it, he had a few sentences that I think you'll like. He called Charleston lovelier than a small city surrounded by heavy industry should be able to be, with a warm southern vibe. And then he described Interstate 79 as cutting ambitiously against the grain of the Appalachian Mountains in the no-nonsense manner of all West Virginians and leading to home. And isn't that beautiful? So Dwight Garner is from West Virginia. He was born in Fairmont in 1965. His parents met after his father went to WVU. His mother went to Fairmont State, where she was homecoming queen. He moved to Charleston soon after he was born, 1 or 2 years later, and was only here until he was 9 years old, and then moved to Florida. But one of the things that I find so interesting about him is he's felt connected to this place. He continued to come back and see family in West Virginia, and his West Virginia-ness, I think, really comes through in his book reviews that are in the New York Times. And so that's what I want to talk to him about, because I find that so interesting that Dwight Garner is one of the most powerful arbiters of who's good and whose stake in culture matters. But he also is always looking out for the underdog. He wrote about Philip Levine, the great poet who captured working class America. He wrote about him in an appreciation that he never shed his outsider sensibility, his awareness of class in American life. And that's what I think of when I think of Dwight. So please welcome him here to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The notion that I would ever give Anna advice about how to run her career is really laughable. And she didn't tell you this was after 5 or 6 beers at a West Virginia night we've had a few times in New York City. It's my great honor to introduce Anna Sale to you all. In New York City, I told a few friends at the New York Times and elsewhere that I was going to be on stage with her, and several women as well as men described having a voice crush on Anna. And something about the tone she has on the radio is just extraordinary. And other people said, please let her be the next Terry Gross. I'm just reporting here, but she just has a great way. And for some of you who are a bit older will understand this reference. Someone else described her as public radio's Jane Pauley, which, if you get that, it just means smart and, just witty and intelligent, but there's a sense of reassurance behind it, very warm. There's never any sense that she's out to get you, even if she is sort of out to get what you know. And it's lovely. Some facts I'd like to read you about Anna and her show. As many of you know, she's the host and editor of Death, Sex, and Money, a podcast on WNYC about the kind of things we don't always talk about. I've always hoped she would add the words drugs, oysters, and gin to those first three words and really kind of go for it. But BuzzFeed recently named the podcast one of the top 12 podcasts that will, quote, make you a better human. And it went to the #1 spot on the iTunes podcast charts quickly after its launch. Before this, she had covered politics for WNYC and had been on NPR in Connecticut and also here in West Virginia. And her stuff has been on This American Life. We've all heard her on PBS, on Slate. I was looking around today online, and many of you know that she graduated from Stanford after growing up here in West Virginia. And one blogger recently who grew up with her called her, quote, at age 12, the coolest girl at Camp Allegheny, which I love. And here is her description of Anna at age 12. Seemingly unaffected by trends, clicks, or most of the things the rest of us worried about, Anna always seemed to me like she knew exactly who she was, at a time when most of us were still struggling to fit in. She had one foot in the future and adulthood in a way I completely envied. She listened to the best music, she cared about the environment, and in feminism in a way that I hadn't even been to consider. This was at age 12. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with Anna Sale.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dwight. And that's my friend Grace Bonney, and she wrote that, and I told her this is basically testament to what it is to grow up with older sisters who make you cool. So that is where that comes from. I want to start with a little clip of tape from Death, Sex, and Money, which again is a show about the things we don't talk about in life that we all deal with and feel alone in dealing with. And this is one of my favorite moments. This is the novelist and nonfiction writer James McBride, who you know from The Color of Water, and the Good Lord Bird, which won the National Book Award the year before last. But I asked him about the period in his life when he was restarting after ending his marriage. And I asked him whether he thought he would ever marry again. And he's in his 50s, and he said, I don't know if I could go through that pain again. And then he said this about love. Let's listen to it.
Love's important. Companionship's important. Sex is good to have, but if your heart's not full, then, sex is like drinking beer. That first one's good. By the 9th one, you're poisoning yourself.
So I play that clip because when I asked Dwight what moments in the show stuck out for him, he said, the one James McBride about beer and sex.
Well, he makes it sound like a six-pack. No, it wasn't that quote so much as the whole interview. If you haven't heard it with James McBride, he's an extraordinary man, and his stories are just terrific. And Anna really gets great stuff out of him, things that I never knew, which, if you don't mind, I think my first question would be, how do you get people to come on your show knowing that you're going to be pressing them in exactly these areas where people often don't want to be pressed?
I think it's interesting because I started the show and thought, Death, Sex, and Money, that's such a gets it, that captures what I'm after, and it's kind of a funny name for a podcast. But then I didn't really think I'm gonna have to be writing emails to people that say, please let me interview on a show called Death, Sex, and Money. That makes it a little hard. But so the next sentence after that is always, this is what this show is about. It's about what we all go through, these moments of transition, and I want to talk to you about X. And so in James McBride's case, he had won the National Book Award, and when he got up on stage and talked about The Good Lord Bird, which also has a West Virginia connection, interestingly, it's about John Brown in a great book. But he was very gracious. He thanked everyone who had helped him during the time of writing the book, and then he paused and he said, this was a period in my life when I lost my mother, my marriage ended, and I lost my niece. And he's kind of cracked and got emotional and talked about what it was to get to spend time with this character who was the lead character in his book. So for me, as someone who wanted to get into these moments of transition in life, that was what I pitched. It was like, I want to talk about that period with you. And it ended up being a really interesting conversation, not so much about the details of divorce, that's not so much what I was interested in, but it was where he chose James? Where he chose to live after he, the apartment and the neighborhood where he chose to live in. He was running a music workshop for kids in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which is a lower income community, after living in a mansion in Pennsylvania. And so he had sort of reset his life, and that's what we talked about.
It was a great interview.
Thank you.
It's funny, in New York City, and I feel like in American culture now, public radio people are some of our most revered storytellers in a way that wasn't true, I don't think, even 15 years ago. It's really come on as a field. And you work for the New York Times, there's a lot of antagonism sometimes towards the old print media. There's always antagonism with journalism of all sorts, but radio has emerged as sort of this really primal, in a way that's sort of old-fashioned and new-fashioned at the same time, primal kind of storytelling mode, and the people who do it are almost unanimously revered in our culture. And I'm wondering if you can tell people a bit about how you went from growing up in West Virginia. Did you have this voice? Did you have to work on it? Can you give us a short version of your path into this profession? Because so many people want to do what you do, I feel like. And it's hard. There are very few slots to do these kind of things in our culture.
Yeah. Well, there are many people here who taught me how to make radio. But it started, I finished college, went to Stanford, I went to George Washington High School, went to Stanford, was a history major, had no intentions on being a journalist. And I moved back to Charleston after college, and I was working for the Sierra Club and feeling like that wasn't quite the right fit for me. I was sort of trying to figure out how do I get to do more writing, and that feels like more of my personality. And I was in the Kmart parking lot at Patrick Street Plaza, and my mom was talking to my Aunt Nell on the phone, and somehow the phone got passed to me, and I was sort of, 23, 24, feeling like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. Should I go to law school? What's the next thing? And she said, just pay attention to who you're really jealous of when you think about what they get to do in the world. And my first thought was, duh, Terry Gross. Then I thought, everyone has that thought. But it was luck that I did apply to law school, so my resume was updated, and West Virginia Public Broadcasting posted a reporter position. And so I went in with my undergraduate history thesis, and I pled my case that I could write and I could learn about audio. I knew nothing about audio. And they hired me and taught me. As far as my voice, I never was aware of my voice except for when I was in college. One of my roommates talked about my molasses voice, and she would like sort of make fun of my southern lilt at the time, and pointed out that I could be a phone sex operator should things go wrong.
Weren't you supposed to have worked at Google? You were Stanford, what?
I know, I was
02,
2003, so I got to Stanford in 1999, the fall, and it was like a very, and I want to talk to you about this because it was so, I wasn't expecting it. Fall of 1999 is before the first .com crash, so it is like peak gold rush at Stanford, and kids are talking about dropping out and to start their startups, and there was a freshman orientation where there was like a skit about how everyone was preparing for their IPO. And I didn't know what an IPO was. I was like, what? And so I felt like I was like on Mars. And it wasn't just like feeling like I didn't understand. I was also really turned off by it. I was really turned off by just that sense of like, how are we gonna cash in? Which in retrospect, I did have a lot of friends who graduated from Stanford and went straight to Google, and they were employees at Google before it went public, and now they're my rich friends. But I think that there's something about growing up in West Virginia that I didn't have words for it at the time, because I didn't, like when I first was a freshman and they made us read Marx, and he's describing class. I remember thinking, that's what was happening in my high school, in the way that we were sort of, not because in West Virginia, my high school, you have race in a lot of places that illustrates class through the way we look. There were definitely black kids in my high school, but not as much as in other parts of the country. And so to understand class and to have words for it, I was like, oh, I get this now. I get what I grew up kind of feeling. And also the other thing about growing up in West Virginia is even the most well-off kids, you get beaten up when you leave the state by having to defend where you're from. And there's an acute feeling of, well, the really wealthy people are elsewhere. And so it's hard for even the most uppity people here to feel that uppity. And Dwight, I was reading a Q&A that you did a few years ago, and you were asked about the book you return to most as a reader, and you said the book was called Class.
It is called Class.
And the subtitle is A Guide Through the American Status System.
This book was written by a historian named Paul Fussell, who's also written very well about World War II and other topics. But he wrote this book sort of analyzing the American class system, and it's a topic that he says, even to speak about it, it's if you were, I think he said, clubbing to death a baby seal using the dead body of a baby, penguin or something. But people just don't want to talk about class in America, and it's this very funny guide through the status system. And it's great not only for that reason, but the fact that he's just a terrific writer, and it's hilarious. It's sort of no holds barred. It's a bit dated now. The things that were classy in 1984 when it came out are not anymore. The culture has changed radically since he wrote this book, but I recommend it highly. I think I read it just because he's a great stylist also, but also, like Anna, I don't think I understood what class was either. I mean, I went to college. I went to college in Middlebury, Vermont, and I arrived there, and my roommate had gone to a very prestigious prep school. I didn't know what a prep school was. I actually didn't know, and a whole world was shown to me that I had no idea existed. And it's funny, the higher you get in New York City and elsewhere in terms of knowing people and learning about things, the more you realize that there are more places like that than we know. I mean, there's always things that we're just unaware of. And so a strong sense of a class awareness has been with me since reading that book, and since meeting the world as someone from West Virginia who just wasn't aware often of how the world works sometimes.
Can you talk about how you think of West Virginia as far as home? Because I think it's interesting that you didn't live here for that many years.
Well, I moved away in second or third grade. I moved to Naples, Florida. And I can't say that my childhood was not terrific there. I enjoyed it. but it's sort of a nowhere place in some way. It's sort of a place that doesn't have, there's no there. I mean, there's a great beach and there's some culture to Naples, but it's a lot of people from Ohio who moved down to get away, as my family did. You know, we moved, people who moved to get away from the north. And I started coming back, or I always came back, but I started coming back more often to visit my grandparents. My grandfather was a coal miner, lived in Mannington, and my other grandfather worked for the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Fairmont. And coming back here, you felt like, well, this is a place, you know? I mean, this is really, there's something real here. And the writers that come here, I began to really admire, particularly Brees DJ Pancake and Jane Ann Phillips, among many others. You know, it's funny, so much of culture, in terms of writers and any kind of artist, it's sort of like, you know, rowing, you know, boat racing. You're sort of pulling in one direction away while looking back exactly where you came from. And that's how so many people who leave places, yet they're just fixated on where they came from. And increasingly, I sort of feel that way. I feel like my family heritage is here. And I keep telling friends that this should become the new place. I mean, it should be the next Wyoming where all the writers move, because you can buy a great house here for, you know, what you get, you know, a shed in everywhere else in West Virginia. So,
What would you do when you come and visit your family in West Virginia?
what would I do?
Yeah, as a kid.
Oh God, just run around, you know? I went to basketball camp. I keep saying that the basketball camp was run by Mary Lou Retton's father, but people seem to have disabused me of that notion. That I must be misremembering, but I'm sure it was.
That's cool.
Yeah, in the 70s. And, you know, just ran around Mannington, West Virginia, you know. The old soda shop was still there, and you could still get a soda for 10 cents and, you know, pulling it out of that machine. It just, Naples, Florida at the time was the fastest growing city in America, I think. And just, you know, the malls had come through, and it just felt empty to me. And it was a great joy to come back here.
I'm going to out Dwight as not an outdoor person.
I was once offered a job at Outside Magazine, and I said, well, if you called it Inside Magazine, I might think about it, which is a bit of a joke. But
and that's the way you started your meditation on driving home to West Virginia, with that very story.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, and you said, but it was interesting because you said the way I reflect is not by going out into nature, it's not by climbing mountains, it's by getting in my car with a stack of CDs and rolling down the windows, mostly at night. And then you said this paragraph. This was the paragraph where I was like, oh, he's from West Virginia. And this was when I was like, I need to be friends with him. Because you wrote, I need these trips to see myself plain. I take out my failings as a husband, as a father, and as a man, and put them on the dashboard where I can study them, like the imagery of a moral GPS unit, one that allows you to scan for alternate routes and toll-free bridges.
Aww. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Well, let's throw this back at you. Where do you look for these things? I mean, do you find, I know that your fiance is a great outdoorsman. Do you find what he finds in the outdoors, and do you find it here in West Virginia?
I find it actually in conversation, and I think that that's where the show came from where Death, Sex, and Money came from. It was like it's by, like, the secret of doing a show about personal stories is everything that I need to know because there's some element that hits on something that I've either struggled with or have thought about or kind of been figuring out. And in that way, I think I'm like the most intensely one-on-one extrovert that you can be, because that's what gives me energy, is by having that kind of intimate connection.
I'm going to praise Anna just one more time and say that the reason her show works, I think, it works for many reasons, but there's this sense that she really doesn't just want to know the answer, but needs to know the answer. I mean, she's really listening intensely, and you feel like you are sort of hoovering up emotional and intellectual information from people. And, you know, it really works on that level. And I wonder, do people walk away from you at parties because you're too intense?
Yes.
Are you asking them about...
I mean, I'm actually, I'm trying to self-regulate a little bit more. Because, because it's like, well, there's two things. There's like the dinner party like thing where people realize that, like, if they start talking to me about and mention that they immigrated 16 years ago, I'm going to want to know, like, the whole experience of that journey and why, and are they in touch with their families, and then the other part is that when I'm home and talking to Arthur, because I feel connected through like intense questioning, Arthur, my fiance, will have to say, Anna, this is not a Death, Sex, and Money episode. Let's just talk about what we're going to make for dinner, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Oh, God. You have been called, speaking of just dinner table conversations, someone called you, I think, the queen of the awkward pause.
Yeah.
Great line. I know what it means. What does that mean? What does it mean to you to be called that?
And we just, an intern just started at Death, Sex, and Money, who's this great young man from Texas named Benjamin Franklin, and he sat in, and that's his real name, and he sat in the studio and listened while I did the interview, and he was like, he comes out and his thing that he says afterwards, he's like, Hannah, there were so many moments where you just like didn't say anything, and I was like, and did you notice? The guest fills it in, and that can't be the whole interview, but strategically deployed, it's also like it's paying attention to when there's a pause that is, because there's processing happening. And I think that even in like personal conversations, it's really easy to crowd into that space because it can be uncomfortable, or you want to make sure they feel at ease. But when you just let it, just for a moment, and then you hear what wheels were turning, it's usually the best tape, what we call in radio, the best moment in the interview. Yeah.
Do people stop you during these interviews and say, let's turn it off for a few minutes and let me
not
get ready to do this?
Not that often. Excuse me, let me move my hair off my microphone. I do say, and this is something that I learned that Terry Gross also says, which makes sense because of the relationship that she forges with the people she interviews. At the beginning of an interview, to say, this is taped, this is being recorded and is not going out live. So if I ask something that feels too tender or uncomfortable or somewhere you don't want to go, just tell me and we don't have to go there. And I think when you say that coupled with the reasons I want to ask you this is because I'm interested in this part of your life, and it's not to be provocative, it's because I want to know how you got through that, then it becomes something that you're creating together. And it's empowering in the best circumstances. But I do try to tell people after an interview, more and more since I've being interviewed more, I'm realizing the emotional toll it can take to be asked these deep questions about things that you don't always sort of go down into in your daily life. So I try to say, totally, maybe get some ice cream after this, walk around the block, watch some Netflix, just take care of yourself, because doing an intense interview about personal stories is taxing. Yeah.
I interviewed Terry Gross once as a cub journalist in the 90s for the Boston Phoenix, and I remember one thing she said, which is that so many people who come onto her show are well known in their fields, and they've told the stories many times, and they've become anecdotes. Meaning that these are just nuggets they can dispense now, almost on autopilot, hitting B12 on the jukebox of my life. And we all do this to some degree. But I'm wondering, as an interviewer who how do you avoid asking the kind of question that prompts the, anecdote, hitting B12 nugget? And can you tell as an interviewer when someone is giving you a rote sort of bullshit answer and you want something better than that?
Yes. Because I think you do this, and I do this before you interview someone. Am I doing this? This is my hair. You do your homework, and so you see what they've said before. There's an example about this that I want to play. Oh, let's do this microphone instead. There's an example.
It's not on.
There's an example of this very thing that I want to play, and it's because it was an episode of Death, Sex, and Money that was inspired by a piece that Dwight wrote. There's a musician named Jason Isbell, and you probably know of him now. You might not have known him before Dwight wrote this beautiful profile in the New York Times Magazine in 2012.
No, it was just
2013.
2 years ago, 2013.
2013. So Jason Isbell, in the moment that Dwight decided to write the profile, was just finishing this album that hadn't come out yet. So often when you hear stories about musicians and artists, it's when they're already on the cycle of promotional tour and they've got their talking points down. Dwight sort of sensed that there was a story here and that this artist was worth spending some time with while the actual album was still being polished. And I just want to read a few moments from that profile because, again, it's Dwight's fantastic writing. Hang on, let me find it in my notes here. So Jason Isbell, when Dwight interviewed him, he'd broken up. He was no longer a part of the Drive-By Truckers, which is a band that he started playing with when he was early 20s. He had a reputation for not being a nice drunk and drinking a lot. And when Dwight interviewed him, Jason was about a year sober and had just gotten married to another musician named Amanda Shires. And Dwight described their apartment as looking like what George Jones and Tammy Wynette's apartment might have looked like if George Jones and Tammy Wynette had gone to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. It's because there's books all over. Amanda was studying English literature while also making music. And then there's another paragraph about Jason Isbell that gives you kind of a sense of his personality. Dwight wrote, he used a single word, evil, to describe Spotify, the online music streaming service. Quote, I think Spotify is honestly just another one of Sean Parker's ways of ripping musicians off, Isbell said, referring to the Napster co-founder who has a stake in Spotify. His comic mini-rant about Parker was so expletive-filled that, to paraphrase Mary McCarthy, even the words and the from it are not printable here. So this is an incredible profile. And my question for you first, Dwight, is this turned out to be an incredible story. The album ended up being lauded on critics' best of list, but you didn't know this at the time.
I lucked out. This was a performer that I loved, and he played with this band that I love called the Drive-By Truckers, but I didn't follow the band closely enough to really know who the people were singing. And I went to their show one night, and they didn't play any of my favorite songs, and I was yelling for these songs, and they probably thought I was a total jackass because I was yelling for songs they don't play anymore because the guy who wrote them had left. And I later found out this was Jason Isbell, and I saw him play one night in Mississippi. I was down there for a story in Oxford at a bar. There was maybe 8 people there. I was so close to him that his wife, the rosin on her bow, was all over my T-shirt. That's how close I was. And he was overweight, looked terrible. I mean, he's a very good-looking man, but he had gained 50 pounds, and big bags under his eyes, and this tiny bar. But the people who were there knew every word. And I remember thinking, this man is sort of criminally, undersung. And going back and pitching the editor of the New York Times Magazine to let me go sit in on the making of his new record. I remember just praying they'd be good because I was going down there, the magazine sent me, and I had this hunch, and it was just this incredible record that I was there to watch happen, and it was just luck. It was a little bit of skill to find the right person, but that's one of the great things about working for the New York Times and having a job like Anna's is finding people who are worthy of the attention. I mean, the great thing about my job is finding those writers who I really think people should know about and shining the spotlight that I happen to sort of possess on their work. And it's the best feeling I get in my work, and I certainly feel it about that piece. I'm really proud of that piece, not only because I think it turned out pretty well, but I feel like I really was there at the right time to help sort of a great artist find his audience, and it's the best feeling you get.
And it launched Jason right as the album was coming out. I think maybe a month or two after, Terry Gross interviews him on Fresh Air, citing the New York Times Magazine piece. And then I become a huge fan of Jason Isbell's music in ways that I hadn't been before because of the piece. And then when I was starting Death, Sex, and Money, I was thinking about, well, what is this show? What are the stories that I want to know about? And I went back to thinking about Jason because Dwight had captured Jason and Amanda when they were just married, when Jason was just on the verge of breaking through, and he was only a year sober. And they had been together during the time he'd gotten sober. She'd been instrumental in helping him stop drinking. And so I pitch Jason and say, so it's been a year since you did this profile, and I want to know about how your relationship has changed in the years since you've become much more famous, since you're away from each other much more because you're touring more. And we have a clip of a really nice moment. One of the one of the things that they talked about was being apart, and how one of the hardest things about being apart is cell phones are things that you can't really trust anymore. And they had trust issues they're working out in their early years of their marriage. And so this is them talking about their phone conversations when he's on the road, when Jason is on the road and Amanda is somewhere else.
Part of me just gets switched off, the part that's very private and very personal and very intimate. That part of me gets shut off. So I've been trying really hard in the last few months to call that part back up when we're checking in with each other, when we're on the phone, to actually, because she feels like she's talking to a robot sometimes, and I understand that. I say, well, I did this, I did that, I did this, now I gotta go sound check. That's not enough for somebody who's missing you. And it's not that I don't miss her just as much. I just have a set of techniques that I use to keep myself from going out and drinking again, or to keep myself from getting exhausted on the road, or whatever. And I need to learn how to navigate those things and still be personal.
I think that's not just a touring musician. I think a lot of boyfriends and husbands and partners have that.
Yeah,
when they're checking in with their partners.
It's a lot like I don't know. It's more like a list conversation rather than a conversation.
A lot of the world turns into checklists for me when I'm on the road. Like, okay, this person's alive, this person's fed, this person's good. Sound check is done. Everything becomes a checklist.
And he goes on to say, and that's not enough for someone who loves you. And what I loved about that moment in the interview was it was the most banal thing, like, what is your phone conversation like when you're calling your wife on the road? But it's so relatable. It's like that struggle of feeling connected when you're not in the same place, and when one of you's busier than the other one. And to hear him, like, in the last few months, I've tried to really be more present in my cell phone conversations. I just really thought, I loved that moment.
It's great.
Yeah. But I want to go back to what you said, Dwight, about the power that you have to shine the spotlight of kind of the American cultural elite on to emerging artists, whether they be writers or musicians. And can you tell me a little bit about that process? Like, when you are looking at the stacks of books that come to you from first-time authors, how do you begin?
I get so much mail every day, probably 30 books or so a day in the mail, and sometimes I'll be away or just not be able to open them. And I live in a small town in western New Jersey called Frenchtown on the Delaware River, and they will pile up by my doorstep. And one day last summer, a woman walked through and knocked on my neighbor's door and said, "I'm worried the people who live there are dead." They heard our dogs barking. But if I get 100 books in a week or 200, out of those, let's say it's 100 for just, 30 I know I won't write about because they're 101 uses for a dead cat, or a book about gardening. I don't do, there can be a fine book, but I don't do those sort of books. And then there's another 10 or 15 that I gravitate towards, or fewer than that, 3 or 4, because I love the topic or love the writer. But the hard part of the job is sitting down once a week or so with a pile of books and trying to read maybe 30 pages in each one, or at least 15. I try to flip around, and you're looking for just a sign of life, really. The kind of writing I love the most is really like basic talk, except better. Better than basic talk, like the kind of talk you would have in your dreams, just sexier, funnier, more to say about the human condition. And that's what, to me, great writing is. I don't really read for story. I like a good story, but I read for those kind of just pokes into the human mind. Great observations. And I often get my kids to lug the books out back from me to my rear office. They now like to torture me by saying that they hate books. But I enjoy the process. I enjoy, trying to find things to like.
You have a code that you've developed that you talked about in an interview where someone asked you about a regret. And you talked about writing a bad review of a first-time author that you could have just ignored.
Yeah, you don't want to write the kind of review where you're basically saying, this thing you've never heard of or never will hear of, well, it's no good. Why do that? Early on at the Times, I wrote a very negative review about a young man who had gone to Mexico to travel and wrote an account of his travels. And it just, he just wasn't a natural writer. And I was too harsh about it. I just, I mean, I wrote the truth. I didn't lie to my readers or to the readers of the Times. But looking back on it, I regret it. I should have just not done it. I don't know what I was thinking. I could have found something else. People have this notion of criticism that I think of sort of Simon Cowell or something. Just the petty put down. Like, you're a singer who was castrated 9 months too late. Just something really mean. And criticism. You mentioned Marx earlier. I mean, criticism. Marx had this idea: the perfect life was, I think, to farm in the morning, hunt in the afternoon, and as he said, criticize in the evening. And what he meant was, criticism is making fine distinctions. I mean, the poet Joseph Brodsky said that snobbery is despair. And it is. What's joy is discrimination. Being a critic is making fine discriminations, putting works of art in context and explaining why things don't work, and talking about an artist like Anna Sale, let's say, and talking about the art of interviewing, and people who do it well and people don't, and people who don't. And it's sort of building context for works of art. There comes a time when you have to, I want to say what I think. I want no one to read a book review of mine and walk away not knowing what I think about the book. And I don't want readers to, criticism in America has become, there are fewer and fewer outlets for it because most newspapers now don't run book reviews. And the book reviews people read tend to be very gentle and nice. And I think I'm far more a lover than a fighter as a critic. And I try to find things to love. But you need to be honest. You're writing for your readers. You're not writing for the author's family. And so it's important to me to say what I think as well.
There was one of my favorite of your biting reviews, and that's been run recently, was about the book called The Mockingbird Next Door. And the headline of his review was To Kill a Friendship. And there were two chief quibbles that you had. One was that you felt like this was about Harper Lee. This is a journalist who had become friends with Harper Lee. And it's, you had ethical questions about what it is to describe the daily life of an aging woman who watches television, fishes with hot dogs, and you seem to think that it was presenting indignities and not giving Harper Lee the respect that she has earned. And then on top of that, it was poorly written. And so you made clear there's one moment where you said she got to sit next to Harper Lee during the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction moment on the Super Bowl, and she didn't even write it well, So that would have been okay if it had been written a little bit snazzier. Yeah. You have to be working for the New York Times. You have 1 million or 2 people reading you every day, and it's an enormous amount of power, and so you have to try to use it wisely. I will say that when I do write a pretty negative review, I get a massive outpouring from people, and I've thought about why this is. On Twitter it explodes. People write me I haven't heard from since 3rd grade, and I'm trying to think about what it is that I think one reason is that people feel like that their wool is pulled over their eyes a lot by reviews that they've read. Everyone has this experience of reading about this great novel over and over again. They pick it up and they don't have the same experience. Like, this is not good. I feel like I've been hoodwinked somehow. And so there's this feeling of yes, I've had this experience. Like someone finally is telling me what they think about a work of art. So the outpouring is of gratitude when you write a negative review. It's not like it's gratitude. It's gratitude, and I try to be funny. Hopefully not at the expense, at least not always, of the person under. But I try to have humor, and I also try to balance. Most negative pieces I write tend to have a lot of praise in them as well, because no one has this book published, by a major publisher without having some talent and some, something going on. So it's rare that I'll write just a wall-to-wall negative review of something. I want to ask you about James Agee, who's someone you have studied and are writing about. And also, interestingly, another man of letters in arts and literature who came from the mountains and made his life in New York. James Agee, I'm writing a biography of him right now. And he was from Knoxville, Tennessee, and wrote A Death in the Family, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote The African Queen, the screenplay for that film. He was the first important American film critic writing for The Nation in the 1940s. He wrote what is
arguably, many people think, I certainly think, the most unusual and maybe the most important nonfiction book of the past century, called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, about tenant farming in Mississippi in the 1930s. So a very complicated person, did a lot of things. Anyway.
Tell me about your pull to him specifically.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of parallels. Here's a man who was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. His parents were quite poor. Left, I mean, he went to Andover, went to Harvard, went to Fortune magazine and Time magazine in the 30s and 40s when there weren't better places to work in America in terms of journalism. And I guess I feel some of that kinship in terms of coming from West Virginia and sort of making, there aren't many people at the New York Times who are from West Virginia. I have met a few of them. There aren't people named Dwight either at the New York Times. It's, you know, when I first went to the book review, I was an editor there for 10 years at the New York Times Book Review. I think 80% of the staff had either gone to Harvard or Yale. All of our staff, you know, drinks events were at the Harvard Club. You know, I was there for 5 years and took it over, and we went to a dive bar after that called Jimmy's, a boxing bar in Times Square. But yeah, I mean, there's a certain love for underdogs that comes from you know, growing up here. I've always loved, you know, A.G. had a real fondness for sort of, you know, blue-collar fiction as well. I mean, he wrote about working men and women in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and I have a lot of that as well. Appalachian writers, and also Southern writers, you know, men like Larry Brown and Barry Hannah and Harry Crews, and there's a strain of American literature which kind of branches up through Southern literature, which comes up through the Appalachian Mountains as well, that I really admire and sort of feel in my heart.
So we are going to open it to questions. So think about your questions. I have one more question for Dwight.
It's my turn to ask you.
Oh, sorry, I'm taking over. But I also want you to think in the back of your head, Dwight, if everyone leaves here and immediately goes and orders books for the summer, if you could recommend 3 of your favorite books as the last question before we leave for the evening.
Okay.
Yeah. So
my head goes blank immediately when people ask me that, but I do have some.
So do you have a question
well,
for
no,
me?
but we're talking about people we admired, you know, like James Agee was, you know, I was a weird kid, I guess, but I loved reading critics even when I was young, because they added, I was one of those kids who grew up in a house without books in it, without culture really, and we had the Bible, we had Reader's Digest condensed books in my house, and my parents are lovely people, but culture was not important to them, and so a sense of sort of finding it on your own was important. I forget where I'm going with this, actually.
Were you going to ask a question?
Well, I was going to ask you about, oh, sorry, here we go. Reading critics early on and finding people to admire. And I'm wondering, who were the people did you have people, interviewers, journalists that you admired and sort of patterned your career on?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really connect this until just as I was already starting Death, Sex, and Money, but one of my favorite newspaper columnists growing up, who I learned to admire from my mom, was Ellen Goodman, who wrote for the Boston Globe and who was syndicated, I think, in the Charleston Daily Mail, who won the Pulitzer Prize. And I just loved her writing. There was something like, she was the column that if I read it, it was going to be interesting to me as a teenager. And I had the opportunity to interview her in the process of starting Death, Sex, and Money. She's now doing a great project around urging families to have conversations about end-of-life care while you can. But she said something really fascinating to me about her career, which was that the lives, like everyday issues of women and of families, did not show up on the op-ed page until she forced it as an important issue to think about, that the decisions we make in our private lives are important, and it's worth kind of taking seriously and somewhere as important and prominent as the op-ed page. And when I heard her say that, it felt like something clicked for me, because as a journalist, learning from people like Beth and learning from people like Scott Finn and Ken Ward, growing up here in Charleston as a cub reporter, I remember feeling this kind of struggle for how do I make sure I'm doing important journalism? Because when you've got people like Ken Ward, running circles around everyone in investigative journalism, how can I do that? And the whisper was like, I don't know if I want to do which felt like, but then am I not affecting things? Am I not kind of going towards the fight or going towards change? And so to hear Ellen Goodman say that, it sort of let me kind of put my shoulders down around treating our personal lives as important journalism, because I think we need it. And I need it. And so it's not, particularly as a woman, you want to make sure you're not going to get relegated to only doing soft features or the style section or being considered less than your male peers. So to hear her say that was like, oh, that must have been what I kind of was like getting when I was reading you in the Charleston Daily Mail. So definitely Ellen Goodman and Terry Gross forever is my hero.
Ellen Goodman is great.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah. Let's open it up to questions now. There's a microphone here, so if you just want to start a line, don't be shy. And we also, if there's anyone streaming, there's social media questions as well, so send questions that way.
Where you're from. Step right up. For broadcast,
Actually, they're
Vic, for
broadcasting it, so they
broadcast.
want to catch you on the microphone.
Go ahead.
Sarah Fox from Charleston, West Virginia.
Hi, Sarah.
Our Charleston Townsend Mall book group discussed Hannah Coulter by Wendell Berry today. Dwight, it seems like you might admire that book, but from what I heard, we agreed that Wendell Berry is a great writer and isn't as well known. Would you tell us your opinion of Wendell Berry?
Oh, he's terrific. I've not read a lot of his work, but I've read him, and he's a great poet, a great essayist, a very good novelist, and sort of just a great American crank in the Emersonian tradition. It just in terms of everything, in terms of technology, and he would never use a computer because he didn't want to have to pay the electric company for his words. He still types, and I admire Wendell Berry a lot. So yeah, good call.
My name is Victor Gregoracci here at Charleston, West Virginia. I'd like to know the nuts and bolts of putting this show together. First of all, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Dwight, very much for doing this. But tell me from beginning to end, how did we get to here today?
To Death, Sex, and Money, the show.
To us being here.
Yes. How did this particular show?
Oh, this particular show. Oh, that's interesting.
The nuts and bolts. In other words, you had to connect each other. You had to have interns do research and all those things you have to do to put on the show today. How did you get here today?
I did my own research. I don't know about you. I don't know about the staff you have to do.
I have no staff.
Well, it started because I started at West Virginia Public Radio, public broadcasting, and I think it was Scott who emailed, Scott Finn, who you met earlier, the executive director, emailed and said, what do you think about coming to Charleston for Festival and doing something related to death, sex, and money? And I thought about it, and I was like, well, I immediately said yes. And then I thought, well, what will we do? And then I was walking to the subway one morning, and I had this thought, like, it would be so fun to bring the pride that I have in Dwight, knowing that he's from West Virginia, to West Virginia, and introducing him to this community in a more sort of intimate setting. Although he travels here on his own, but it made me excited to think about talking to him about the values of his work and how he got to do what he was doing. And so I proposed that, and they said yes. And then people at West Virginia Public Broadcasting and Festival did everything else, and then we showed up. Yeah.
Sarah Hambley, Charleston, West Virginia, and this is for Anna. I just wanted to know, as a listener, I've taken so much from Death, Sex, and Money from the people who you have interviewed. What's been the one thing or the one person who you've had, I guess, the best takeaway from who you've interviewed, or the best life lesson that you've learned?
Oh, that's good. That's a good question. Sarah Hambley went to high school with me.
Yes, I did.
It was nice to see her. There's lots of answers to this question, and there's pretty much any episode I could say something that changed me. But the one that I want to talk about is the one that was one of the first episodes of the show, which was very much about me and something that I was going through in the moment. It was Arthur, who I mentioned earlier, is now my fiance. When I was beginning to think about Death, Sex, and Money, we broke up. He had been my boyfriend, and we broke up because he's an ecologist. He was spending a lot of time in Wyoming. I was in New York. And I just got to a point where I was like, I can't waste time. I'm divorced, I'm in my early 30s, things gotta happen if they're gonna happen. And so Arthur and I split up, and we both agreed. And then I got wind that he stopped agreeing and he wanted to get back together. But it was one of those things where it was like, come on, let's just take some time. And then I got a phone call on my cell phone from the former senator of Wyoming, Alan Simpson, which made no sense. And it turned out that Arthur knew that having covered politics, knew that I thought Alan Simpson was like a fun character. And he thought, like, I need to like change the dynamic here because this has gotten to be one of those moments in a relationship where everything is hard and heavy and we're not really communicating. And so he wrote Alan Simpson a letter and asked him to call me to sort of like plead his case. And there was an actual thing. Arthur was being honored. He was getting an award in Wyoming, and I was supposed to be his date at this event in Wyoming where Alan Simpson was going to be. And I told him I wasn't going to be his date anymore. And so Alan Simpson was basically saying, come to this ball. I'll dance with you if you come. But the perfect thing about it was, as Alan Simpson is on the phone with me saying, I got the weirdest letter, I can't believe I'm actually calling you, his wife, Anne, who I didn't know, starts yelling in the background of the phone. And they've been married for 60 years. And Al says, Anne finally told me, I needed to just call because what have I got to lose? And then I said, well, what's Anne think I should do? And so he hands the phone to Anne, and Anne says to me, I don't know what's going on. We don't know you, but I know that every couple has a hard time. And we went through a hard time when we had little kids. We found couples counseling through our church, and it was really valuable. And do you love him? And then she said, just don't let your pride get in the way. And I have a lot of pride. So this was something I needed to hear. And so the episode ended up being about this relationship that Arthur and me had together with Alan and Ann Simpson. And I went to Alan and Ann Simpson in Wyoming and interviewed them about their relationship and their marriage and about getting through those difficult times. And that was an episode that was really about something that I was like right in the middle of figuring out. And it was such a comfort to me to just, to hear anyone and then to hear people who are politicians who their whole lives is about constructing an image of, confidence and having no problems ever, that they were willing to open up and to be honest about hard moments was really instructive for me, and I learned a lot of things about marriage. One of which was, Anne told me, she's like, I married Alan, and I realized, I was thinking about it, like, when you're trying to decide whether to wash your hair, you'll understand this, she told me. She's like, you're like, I could wash my hair today, but maybe I'll wait a day, and I couldn't really decide. And she's like, that's how I was when I first got married. And she's like, and I was married. And it was very much about like finding the courage to make decisions. Because when you don't make those decisions, you're making a decision. And I really took a lot from that.
My name's Terry Burhans. I'm from here in Charleston, and West Virginians like to celebrate and party. Could you, either one of you, or together describe how you guys party in New York? Is it adult beverage based? Is it food based? Is it sports related? What is it?
This is awesome. This is a thing that we haven't done often enough, but when we have done it, it's been really special. And it's alcohol-based partying.
Definitely.
It's a happy hour, and Dwight knows from West Virginia. You've brought some West Virginians from the New York Times.
Marianne Reed, who is the Dean of Journalism at WVU, gave me a list of New Yorkers who were roughly in the media who were from West Virginia, and it was very helpful. And Anna knew some people as well, and it's a really great group.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because you know, being in New York is like always about this like hustle and fighting for your space, and it's interesting to me how it just feels relaxing to be with people, even if there's not much else you share in your lives in New York, but there's something that feels restorative about being together, and you find out you have things to talk about, even if nothing else looks the same, because you can talk about home, and it's been really fun. And the other cool thing about it is, like, here I am, like, public radio reporter finding my way in New York, and after Dwight wrote the piece in the New York Times about West Virginia, we became like Twitter buddies. And then I can't remember who emailed whom first, but when I was like, maybe we should get together, and then that he was up for it, like the Times book critic wanted to like hang out with me and a bunch of West Virginians and would like come from New Jersey into town to do it. It was just like, this guy is the coolest. Yeah.
I will say, just picking up on the Twitter thing, there's a kind of West Virginia mafia on Twitter a little bit. There's like 6 or 7 people. It's loose, but you sort of pick up on what's happening.
There's someone here, Elaine is here, who's part of the mafia. Elaine McMillian, who made Hollow, who hopefully you've heard of, and if you haven't,
terrific movie.
It's amazing, Peabody Award-winning documentary work based in McDowell County, who is part of the Twitter mafia from West Virginia.
Virginia, and I follow both of you on Twitter, and I know you have active social media presence, and I wanted your perspective on social media in this age that we live in and its impact on both literature and the art of writing and the art of conversation these days.
That's a good question.
I happen to like Twitter. I mean, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of problematic things about it, but sometimes I'll pick up a new book from a writer I might not have heard of, and I see if they have a Twitter account. I'll go look at it. You know, you can tell from Twitter if you've got a live one on your hands. You know, you really can. I mean, as a writer, I mean, Twitter is writing, and it's condensed writing, and I think people have learned more about writing in a tight way from Twitter than they ever learned from Strunk and White, you know, or at least this generation. So, yeah, you know, and there's some terrific writing on there. I mean, someone said recently that the only way to be serious in our literary culture is not to write an important essay for the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. There are many ways to be serious, and people can be serious on Twitter. I mean, there are real conversations happening there. So I do use it for fun. I probably spend too much time on it. I don't know. I make mistakes on it. I get called on things sometimes because you write things, and it's, you know, you might have had maybe it's 8 o'clock and you've had 2 beers and you're watching something on television, or you're reading a book and you write something about it and people are waiting to pounce. I don't know what your experience is.
Well, I think there's 2 parts of Twitter. Like the good part is it allows you to kind of keep a constant sense of the zeitgeist, and it's multiple zeitgeist. Like for me, following prominent African-American writers and activists during this time of so much upheaval in this country, like to just get to have access to a dialogue that I might not be able to have if we were sitting in a room together, is special and important, and it changes the way I think about things, and it makes me have a broader perspective. The bad part about Twitter for me is it's compulsive, and I feel like feeds my ego in a way that's unhealthy, because the other part about social media that you're doing is performing for approval of the crowd.
A friend of mine has a phrase for it. Well-known people and writers on Twitter who tweet a lot, he calls it fame maintenance, which is just sort of keeping your name out there in a little way in between, you know.
Fame maintenance.
Anyway.
Go ahead, please.
I'm Russ Young. I'm from here in Charleston. It's nice to see you, Anna. And you mentioned earlier, you talked a little bit about the awkward pause. And I really enjoy the Charlie Rose interviews. But one thing that he does that really bugs me is that he tends to walk all over his interviewees. He'll ask a question, and if he thinks of another question before that person's done, he goes into the second question before, but nobody seems to mind. I mean, you know, Henry Kissinger and Tony Blair, and it doesn't matter who it is. They seem to enjoy speaking, you know, talking with him so much that when he goes out of bounds of tactfulness, they don't. And I just wondered what you thought about his style.
You know what? I think that there's lots of really effective ways to interview, and I think that the way you described the Charlie Rose way as sort of much more about like, it's like an aggressive game of badminton. Like it's like, and it's keeping the ball up. For me, what I'm more interested in is the slow kind of pull out and unfolding, which is just a quieter process. But I think that both are important, and in particular when you're talking to newsmakers and politicians and decision makers, like that more sort of leaning forward and combative style of interviewing is warranted, because you've got to break in so they don't just rattle off their talking point that's the safe material and they don't get to the really important question that you asked. So I think that both styles are important.
Hi, my name's Janelle. I am actually from New York and moved to Charleston about 2 years ago with my husband, who's a West Virginian. And, while we were dating, he always talked so fondly of West Virginia, but then had a lot of negatives about it. He would always be really defensive about, his home state. And then after we got married, he said, there's nowhere I want to raise my kids other than West Virginia. And I was really confused by that. And so I was just wondering, I feel like this is a little death, sex, and money on the spot for you, but do you think you're ever going to have that draw when you have kids, like to come back and like give them that same upbringing that you had?
I absolutely understand that draw. Well, the first question I have for you is, are you allowed to say negative things about West Virginia?
I have no negative things to say about West Virginia.
That's the right answer. Because that's really important when you're brought into the fold. It's like that you understand the rules. I definitely, the pull was there before I, even thought about having kids and where to raise kids. Like leaving and going to Stanford, I was like, what is my feeling and why do I want to go back to West Virginia? And in part was a reaction to Silicon Valley, as I described, but the other part was to grow up in a place where you feel like you have a slot where you fit and where it matters that you're there it's really special. And you realize that when you talk to people who grew up in kind of more anonymous suburbs or who don't feel any connection to a place where they grew up. As far as where I will raise kids, I don't think I'm going to live in West Virginia again, and I've just started saying that out loud fairly recently, and it's been interesting to be home. I was home last month, and I'm home again, and to be here and to feel all of the feelings of warmth and connection that I always have, and to know that I'm not probably going to live here in the near future. It changes the relationship a bit. It's like it makes it more bittersweet. Just for me, it doesn't quite feel like it's the right place to be, and I'm making peace with that. But it's taken a long time, and I don't think I'll ever feel like that's a resolved decision. It's just there will just be a pull. It's like thinking about childhood. Like if you could go back to childhood, but sometimes you can't go back in quite the same way that you feel pulled to.
I think about coming back. I wish my grandfather was the coal miner. They were not wealthy people, but in Mannington, they're an extraordinary Victorian. 3 floors and 6 bedrooms, and as a child just running up the staircases and sliding down the banisters and having this kind of space, which no one in New York City, and even though I've lived all over in the city, in Brooklyn, but no one within 2 hours or an hour and a half of New York City has space. It just doesn't exist. I live in a nice house, but it's a small house, and I dream sometimes of coming back here. My wife does not. And whenever I'm in this town, I'm just struck by what's going on here. I go to Taylor Books, and last night seeing Ann Magnuson here, and all the young artists and the new restaurants, and I just can't believe how groovy it is here. And so you just feel. I shouldn't admit this, but I have this hilarious magnet on my fridge that I only bought because it was so crazy. I couldn't believe. A friend, I think, saw it online and sent it to me. It says, West Virginia is overrated. And I just have to have that. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. I don't know where he found it, but it's so clearly undervalued, and it's so clearly excellent in so many ways that I can see it. My problem is I need so much culture. I have this hole in my soul where I need to see bands and plays and movies, and I just hope that it grows here, so there's just a bit more going on. Also in Morgantown, I mean, it's too bad that both places somehow can't meld there. You feel like there's just this nascent greatness in both places in terms of the culture.
You should go on a tour talking about I-79 and use that line. It could be transformative.
Mike Plant, Charleston, West Virginia. Anna, welcome home.
Hi, Mike.
As I was sitting here listening, when Dwight mentioned James Agee's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, I had a professor as an undergrad who was transformative for me, who had introduced me to that book. And he was sort of the person in my life who pulled back the veil and said, there's this whole world out there. And he would do that through sort of doing what you do in a different way at the New York Times by telling us, this is a book you have to read, regardless of the class that he taught or the subject that he taught. This is an amazing book, you have to read this. And Let Us Now Praise Famous Men was one of those things. So I was wondering, you both have talked about famous people that have been instrumental to you, like Terry Gross for you. But Dwight, was there someone in your life, either in college, high school, or somewhere that is not a famous person who did that for you, pulled back the veil and said, there's this world out there that you should know about?
That's such a great question. And yeah, for me, I went to public high school in Naples, Florida, Naples High School. And, again, finding my way, really knowing to talk to about the books I love, the other things I love. And I had two teachers, Jack Morris and Don Glancy, who not only turned me on to a lot of great books, but also music. They'd bring in these Tom Waits records and these blues records and, Bobby Blue Bland records and just, and crazy Dylan stuff. And just, you're going to like this. Take this home and put it on. And, people need those kind of figures in their lives when they're that age. And they were sort of there for me. And thank God, I just want to say rest in peace, Don Glancy. He died just a couple of months ago. And luckily his wife, before he went, allowed me to call him in the hospital. And she just he couldn't talk anymore, but held up the phone while I just, told him I had a chance to tell him, which people don't get the chance often enough, how much he meant to me and how I just listed the records even, in the books. And it was a great chance for me to say what he meant. And yeah, I'm lucky to have had those people.
That's nice.
Do you have similar?
Mike Youngren, who's sitting right here. Mike, I met him through his wife, Penny. And because it was during my turmoil, my Kmart parking lot turmoil time in life when I was trying to figure out what to do. And I told Penny that I was thinking about public radio and had no idea how to get in. And she said, maybe talk to my husband. And Mike was running the production at West Virginia Public Broadcasting at the time. And we had coffee at Taylor Books. And we talked. We didn't talk. We argued. But I left feel like we just talked about books and ideas and story, and then we left, and I was like, well, that didn't get me a job. What just happened? And it was a few months later that I applied for the job and got to be interviewed by Mike. But the thing that I think about it was like Mike was the person in the newsroom that when he would go, I was like, yes, that's what I'm going for. So he taught me a lot about capturing life on television and in radio, which is really hard to do. Hi, Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Ireland. I'm from Charleston, West Virginia, and thank you both for being here. A couple of times tonight, I've been sitting here and my eyes welled up because of beautiful writing and great conversation and intimate moments and an honest conversation resonates with me, and I'm just sensitive that way. But I wonder for you, Anna, do you ever, you're having quiet conversation with people and asking them to be very intimate. Do you ever lose your composure or get emotional yourself? And if so, how do you handle that? And does that ever play into the interview itself?
That's a good question, because I've been surprised what happens to me, because when I'm not working, when someone tears up, like what my response is to tear, like I tear up. That's what happens. When I'm working and interviewing someone and that happens, in that moment, all of my energy is around making sure they know that it's okay to take as much time quietly as they need. So it's about saying, letting them sort of compose themselves, saying, take your time, kind of gauging, like, if we need to move on to something else, or if it's somewhere that they feel comfortable talking more about. And so I've been noticing that I sort of disassociate, and I'm thinking about what's being recorded, which has been kind of interesting to notice. There's a moment that I can think of. There's an episode of Death, Sex, and Money where I interviewed a prisoner at Sing Sing who's been in prison for more than 20 years on a murder charge. He was involved in a shootout in a movie theater when he was a teenager, and an innocent bystander was shot and killed. He fired his gun one time, and another teenager died just by going to a movie. And I asked him, the prisoner, about if the family of this victim heard our interview, what he wanted to make sure they heard him say. And at that moment, he started crying. And it was just like, this is someone who's been in prison for more than 20 years. You want to just let that moment be, and not kind of, it's okay, like never say like, it's okay, it's not okay. This is an enormous mistake that he made in his life, and there were enormous consequences. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about. It's not the emotional response, or my role as an interviewer is not to comfort. Thanks.
Is Arthur worried that for the next 20 years you'll be discussing him and your relationship?
I know.
Not only his, but death, sex, and money, and Arthur.
I know. Arthur shows up. It's been really good to like, because part of my personal life, I talk about things in my personal life on the show. It makes us have conversations about like what's private, what's not private, and so we have those conversations before anything goes out. So those are healthy conversations to have as a couple too. We have one more question, and then I'm going to ask you about the books, Dwight. So remember that.
My name is Arla Ralston. I'm from Buckeye, West Virginia. And I have a question for both of you. What advice do you have for us to have better conversations? Because it's very easy to get into ruts where you're just sharing information. And how can we take what you all do and translate it into our lives?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think you have to make a committed effort to push past small talk, At least with people you care about, and sometimes even more people you don't, because people you're never going to see again are the best people to have, or you're going to see rarely or once, or just meet, are the best people to really get into it with about everything. I mean, sex, death, and money, because I was reading this book on the way here, actually, on the airplane. I'm going to review it next week in the Times. It's called Blackout by Sarah Hepola, and it's about her life as a drinker and blacking out a lot, just not remembering the night before. And she has this great line in it. She said the kind of what she wants to do in her writing is to have this last call at the bar sense of, I only have 3 minutes, let's get it all on the table right now. And that's what good art does, good writing does, and like good conversation. We're not here for very long. You're not there for long at the dinner table with anyone. And my wife accuses me of being rude sometimes, and I don't think she means mean, just by, like, your show, just asking questions that are a bit too intimate. But people can say no. Not to you, they can't.
I think that's like something that I've thought about a lot, about what makes a good conversation, and I think it's when you feel like you're being listened to. And I think that this is not something that I knew I was learning, but when you start out in radio, one of the first things you learn is not to talk over your tape. So when someone's saying something, you don't go, because you don't want to make that sound on your tape. So I became then a very aggressive nodder in conversation. So I'm all about eye contact and nodding, and that makes people say more, because when just the smallest, just hearing it kind of has like let's pick up the pace, So I think I still deploy that a lot with the show, and just the quiet and eye contact, and but the biggest thing is just we're busy, we're moving fast, and to feel like someone is really asking you something and really wants to know. You're saying things out loud that maybe you haven't put together, and that feels really, again, I feel like it can be very empowering, and then you feel connected, and that's what we're all here for, is to feel like we're connected. So that's conversation. Reading is also important because that connects us to people that we might not otherwise ever be in the same social spaces with. Are there 3 books from current, all time, 3 books that if everyone marched over to Taylor Books and ordered, what would you recommend?
I'm just going to do 2 with an asterisk.
Okay.
From this year, the photographer Sally Mann, some of you might know, she's from Virginia and was controversial in the 90s for photographs she took of her very young children on her property. The children were unclothed in many of these photographs, just playing in the mud in the woods, and just beautiful photographs. And your kids were sort of just angelic in them, and also satanic in the way the kids can be. They're dark and strange photos. And she's written a memoir called Hold Still, meaning, in terms of the camera and many other things. And she's just led this big life in a big house. And Bohemian, knew tons of artists, Cy Twombly and many other people, and just an unconventional person. Just, you read her book and she just not like other people. It's almost if Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird grew up, she might be something like this, just really different, kind of a tomboy, and the book is very sexy and very honest and just great. And it's odd that not many people are so talented at 2 things. Her photographs are great, and as a writer, she's great. The second book I would recommend from this year is called One of Ours, and it's about those horrible murders in Norway, you might remember, where that sort of lunatic went out and killed all the children of the left-wing political group who were gathered on this island and sort of shot them one by one and killed 87, I think, of them. And Norwegian writer Anna, I'll mangle her last name, but like Anna, I'm just going to say Sauersgaard. That's not quite it. But she has written an intense book about it. Just no frills, just building it sort of like a bird's nest, just piece by piece. And it's so well done and so intense. It reminds me of, just the best nonfiction we have. I quote in it a great line. This is my asterisk. Roy Blunt Jr., the writer, wrote a great book about the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is one of my favorite books. It's called About 3 Bricks Shy of a Load, and it came out in 1973. And it's a brilliant book, not just because it's about the Steelers, the team that I love, but he has this great line in it. He says, and I used it in my review of this Norway book, if you won't talk to me, I'll describe your face. If you won't look at me, I'll describe the back of your head. And just like he's not going to give up. And that's the sense I got from this book. Like this killer wouldn't talk to her, but she has every thought that went through his head by pouring through all of the interviews he had to do with the police. And it's scary, but it's brilliant. So those are 3.
Thank you, Dwight. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you to West Virginia Public Broadcasting and Festival.
Thank you, Anna.
Have a great night.